Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2024 revisions to 2CFR Part 200 webinar. Before we get started, I am just going to go over a few housekeeping tips. First tip, maximize your browser window to make sure you can see all of the controls. This is especially important if you want to use the closed caption feature. Your audio is controlled by the device you are using to join this webinar. For example, your cell phone, desktop computer, or tablet. If you're experiencing trouble with the sound or audio, turn up the volume on the device you're using. Make sure your device is not muted. If that does not work, make sure your broadcast is not paused by clicking the spacebar or anywhere on the screen. We are using a Microsoft Teams live event platform. This is like a live TV broadcast. You will be able to hear me and see the presentation. However, you can engage with the EPA team by sending questions. Use the Q&A panel located on the top right side of your window. Click Ask a Question, which will direct your questions to the moderators. This webinar will be conducted in English, and closed captions are available in Arabic, Chinese, English, Filipino, Spanish, and Vietnamese. On the bottom right corner of your window, click the CC button to turn on live captions. Use the tool button right next to the CC button to select the language. A note about these captions, these are live captions that are automatically generated in real time as the speakers are talking, so they will not be 100% accurate. Lastly, I would like to mention that we are expecting a lot of questions to come in today. If we don't get to your question or your question requires more research, don't worry, we will be posting the questions as well as the recording and the answers after the webinar finishes in the coming weeks. Now, I would like to turn it over to our first presenter, Shanika, who will go ahead and get us started. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shanika Snipe. I'll be presenting along with my colleague, Christopher Kent. We're from OGD's MPTCD division. So let's get started. So this is the 2024 revisions to CFR 200's I'm so sorry, guidance. A little tongue twisted there. And so just a little bit on the background. As you may or may not know, OMB announced that there will be some revisions and changes to the 2CFR guidance. And so today we're going to kind of jump into that. As Victoria said, questions, you may place your questions into the question box, and those on our policy teams are working diligently behind the scenes to answer your questions. Again, if your question is not answered today, no worries. You may come back to our EPA's grant webpage for the Q&A, which will be posted in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much, and please pack your patience. Next, on this slide, I do want to highlight a few things that the changes would focus on. That will be evaluation, data, community engagement and public participation, notice of funding opportunities, which is in NOFOs, labor, as well as burden reduction. Just a quick note also that we will be focusing on each of these components except for NOFOs. We're not going to go too much in detail on those because those will be covered in other support materials. Next slide. All right, so we're going to start with some of the blanket changes to the language. And so there's some language changes here, some acronyms that have some changes to them, and then there's some revised definitions. And so with the language changes, I'm going to go over those. So cost sharing or matching is now just cost sharing. Federal awarding agency is now referred to as federal agency. For-profit organization is now included within a private entity. And then non-federal entity is now referred to as the recipient and or subrecipient. In terms of acronyms, there were some removals and then there was an addition. The ones that were removed were FAPIS, FAIN, and PTE. The ones that were added were NOFOs. The revised definitions that you would that you note as we go through the presentation is the improper payment, Indian tribes, indirect cost, participant, questioned cost, and supplies. Next slide. All right, and so this talks about the guidance around whistleblower protections and termination. I do want to note that the whistleblower protections is a new section. So 200.217 is new. That was not in the guidance previously. And now an employee of a recipient or subrecipient must inform their employees in writing of employee whistleblower protections. And so that's in place now. Regarding termination, if an award no longer meets the program goals or agency priorities, it used to be mandatory for termination. However, now it's discretionary. One other thing that I want to note is that all termination provisions are captured in the T&Cs. Next slide. All right, looking at the 200.204 of the guidance, which is the NOFO or Notices of Funding Opportunities. With this, these changes and revisions were made to reduce burden on the recipients as well as the grants community. And with the NOFOs, there was a format change. And so within that format, there are some changes with the basic information, eligibility, program description, application contents and format, submission requirements and deadlines, application review information, award notices, post-award requirements and administration, and other information. Again, it's just a change to the format of these particular areas, and this was a major overhaul that happened across EPA. Next slide. All right. 200.317 of the guidance. So this is the procurement by states and Indian tribes. This was a major change for tribes. Tribes are now able to follow their own procurement policies and procedures. So there's more flexibilities with tribes. And so how do tribes now handle procurement? They can use their written policies and procedures. However, if they don't have their own, then they can just follow the federal policies and procedures. So that was like a major change for tribes that had not taken place in the past. Next slide. I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, Christopher Kent, who's going to start with the next set in the guidance.
Hello. Thank you, Shanika. So I'm Christopher Kent. I work with Shanika. I'll get you guys started on some competition and procurement information. Of note on this slide that is a big change is the removal of the prohibition on geographic preferences. It now allows folks to have geographic preference in contractors or entities they'd like to hire. I think that's a big deal and should help out a lot of folks. Otherwise, on this slide, I'd just like you to note that this new language has been added on methods and materials regarding formal procurement methods and recycled materials. But like I said, I think the biggest news on competition in this slide is the removal of prohibition on geographic preferences. Continuing on, we'll talk about more procurement. So on the next slide, I'd like to point out a few changes. The first of which is the word change for small purchase. You'll no longer see small purchases referenced in 2 CFR 200. Rather, you'll see simplified acquisitions. Just a small word change, but it might have big implications as you read. So just remember that has changed. As well, within these micro purchases, the micro purchase threshold is $10,000. But the biggest thing is now that each recipient and subrecipient can establish a threshold for micro purchases up to $50,000. There's a little self-certification with that, so you have to be approved by the cognizant agency, which is us, the EPA, to get that $50,000 approval threshold. But that is now a new item in the 2 CFR 200. Other procurement changes that I like to point out is the formal bids. Tribal entities are no longer required to open sealed bids publicly. And that lastly on this, you should note that you should remember, as always, but just to note on this slide, to record and keep your records. That's important for any grant information, but this has been specifically mentioned now in the procurement methods 200.320. Going on to the next slide, we'll just overlook some changes to thresholds. So I'm going to take a moment and pause on this screen So to explain what's going on, but so folks can take a snapshot of it if they haven't gotten access to the presentation already. What's going into this slide is it's a table detailing the threshold changes that occurred in 2 CFR 200. There's several changes, as you can see, from equipment to fair market, supplies, audit requirements. All those new thresholds are listed in that second column, or the third column rather, under new amount in the color green. The previous amount and the last column striked out in red. So you can see there's been major increases to some thresholds, including the indirect cost de minimis rate is now up to 15%. We'll explain that later, but I just want to highlight that to you because I know that's a big deal for folks. So again, I'll take a second, take a screenshot if you want to. This is just good, quick reference to the threshold changes that occurred in the 2 CFR 200 updates. Okay, that was a quick second. If you took a screenshot, that's great. If not, folks will have access to this presentation so you can reference these materials on your own. We'll go on to the next slide, talking about prior written approval. So the next two slides are talking about the changes that happened to prior written approval. Some big changes. First and foremost, I'd like you to know that the reasonableness and allocability of certain costs under federal awards may be difficult to determine. So to avoid subsequent disallowance or dispute based on unreasonableness or non-allocability, you as a recipient may seek the prior written approval of the federal agency, the EPA, before incurring those costs. So that's what prior approval basically is. You have to get some approval before you make some costs or make some changes, which I'd like to highlight. In the list of prior approval is 200.308 revision of budget and program plans. There's a slide on that separately towards the end of this presentation, but I'd like to highlight this because that's a new item. We're now requiring some prior approval if you're making revisions to the budget or program plans. But the big news I'd like to say is on the next slide, and that is that some prior approvals that required prior approval previously have now been removed. So these items that you see listed here, real property, entertainment costs, memberships, participant support costs, selling and marketing costs, taxes, if you go into those sections that are listed, they no longer require prior approval. Now, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean you're allowed to just willy-nilly these costs. These still have to be allowable, these still have to be applicable, and these still have to be reasonable, but you no longer are required to have prior approval. Big asterisks though, folks. Take note, equipment 200.313 says it's no longer required to have prior written approval. There's an exception. In 439, 200.439, we still require prior approval for equipment. So you may see it written that equipment doesn't need prior written approval. It's kind of a little gotcha. It does still require prior approval, and you'll find that in 439. Going on to the next slide is we're talking about equipment, and I'll turn it over to Shanika to get into that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And so talking about equipment, as Chris mentioned, equipment still does require prior approval. There are some exceptions in there, so you definitely want to read the guidance to make sure that you are informed on that. You can see 200.407 as well as 200.439. There's another piece that I do want to highlight with equipment, and that's speaking on the disposition. It now happens every 2 years. And so the disposition, the physical inventories happen every 2 years. And then if we take a look down at the bottom at 200.439, there was a threshold amount that has changed. It's increased. The threshold amount for equipment used to be $5,000. However, now the threshold is $10,000 or more. And so that's something very big to note with the changes with the guidance surrounding equipment. Next slide. Okay, headed to supplies. And so supplies is 200.314. Then you have some in 200.453. And so, excuse me. Unused supplies that recipients of federal funds are required to sell at the end of the grant award period has increased. So there was also a threshold increase with supplies. It used to be $5,000 and now it has increased to $10,000. And so that's the major takeaway that I want you to note for the guidance surrounding supplies. Also, if unused supplies are sold, the recipient or subrecipient may be able to retain $1,000 of the proceeds to cover expenses associated with the selling and handling of the supplies. That's only if the awarding agency or pass-through approves it. So please, please, please make sure you read that guidance so that you are on board with that. Next slide. All right. So looking at 200.438, that is entertainment and prizes. With this particular guidance, it used to just say entertainment. However, prizes was added to this guidance. So generally, this is not allowed in terms of the entertainment and prizes. However, there are some exceptions. So if it's allowed if you have a specific and direct programmatic purpose and it's included in your federal award, then it's allowed. However, I do want you to see 200.438 so that you can really dive deeper into the specifics around how this can happen or how it's allowed. Next slide. Looking at 200.333, fixed amount subawards, there was also a threshold change with fixed amount subawards. And so it used to be $250,000. Now it has increased to $500,000. Again, it used to be $250,000. It has now increased to $5,000. And so EPA allows fixed amount subawards, but they require prior approval. If this is something that you would like to approach, you would coordinate with your PO around this, but that's like the biggest takeaway that I have for you here with fixed amount subawards. I am now going to turn it back over to my colleague, Christopher, who's going to start you guys off with the modified total direct cost and indirect costs.
All right, thank you, Shanika. So modified total direct costs and indirect costs. This one was hard for me to understand at first because modified total direct costs can kind of be a tricky definition. I was told and given a great analogy that think of modified total direct costs as a cake and indirect costs as frosting. When you have a cake, the base layer is going to be all the flour, the eggs, the sugar, and with a grant, the base layer is going to be all your direct costs. So that makes up the cake. Now, all these indirect costs are the frosting on top. Not to say that the indirect costs make it look pretty, but for the sake of the analogy, they're on top of the cake. So with this update to modified total direct costs, a big change has been that $50,000 of each subaward will now be included in the MTDC base. So the base of your cake is now a bit bigger, meaning you can put a little more frosting on that cake in terms of indirect charges. Along with this, in terms of indirect costs, we have raised the de minimis up to 15% from 10%. So a little woo-woo. The feds kind of did something right. I have been told people have been excited about that. So yes, the de minimis rate is 15% now as opposed to 10% as it has been in the past. This is a rate where if you don't want to have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, you can kind of just fall back to this 15%. In terms of updates to the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, we as the feds, or the EPA specifically, must accept any negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. We can't force you as a recipient to lower that agreement rate. And that goes to you, though, as a recipient. For any subrecipients that you might have, you can't force them to use a lower rate either. So whatever you negotiated upon to create your indirect cost rate agreement is what you have to use. Again, if you don't want to go through this negotiation and just kind of want to have a quick indirect cost rate, the de minimis rate is now 15% as opposed to 10%. So we'll go on to the next slide, moving away from modified total direct costs into cost sharing. So cost sharing is now a singular term. You'll see it referenced in the 2 CFR 200 as cost sharing. It used to be cost sharing or cost matching when it was talked about in the guidance. So it is now written as cost sharing. Now, I would like to note that it doesn't mean match doesn't exist. It's just now more clear that matching is a type of cost sharing as opposed to a synonym to cost sharing. So you'll see it in 2 CFR 200 written as cost sharing, and just know that matching is a type of cost sharing. Along with the changes to the terminology in cost sharing, I'd like to highlight that merit review has changed. So any voluntary cost share now is not a factor in competition for either research grants or any other financial assistance agreement. So we can't use voluntary cost share as a way to heighten the merit during a review of an application. And lastly, I'd like to point out that for institutions of higher learning, voluntary uncommitted cost sharing is treated differently now from mandatory or voluntary committed cost sharing. And you can read more about that in 200-306 subsection K. That's a new section regarding institutions of higher learning for cost sharing. Going on to program income. So program income, now we're encouraging you to earn some income, make some money, folks. But that's to say you can only use this income you incurred on costs during the period of performance or otherwise allowable costs in your grant. I want you to know that if you do earn some income through your program, that you have to use that money first before you draw down more funds from ASAP. So that ASAP funding tool that the federal government has set up, if you earn any income, you'll have to use that first before you draw down more funds. EPA's default position on income is addition, meaning if you have a $200,000 grant and you earn an income of $10,000, you now have $210,000 in federal award money to use on your grant program. But again, I'm going to highlight this. You need to use the money you made from the income first before you draw down more funds. But we are encouraging you to make some money or to make some income. I'll go on now to requirements for pass-through entities. So I just want to give a quick definition. A pass-through entity is a recipient or subrecipient that provides a subaward to a subrecipient, including lower tier subrecipients. So you can be a subrecipient of a subrecipient to carry out a specific part of a federal program. So the changes that happened in 2 CFR 200 are now greater monitoring. So you now have greater monitoring expected of you relating to significant developments that might negatively affect a subaward. So anything that incurs an audit or finding, you'll have more monitoring on that. There's also an increased document need. Slightly. We now require recipients or pass-through entities to submit technical specifications of proposed procurements when requested by their awarding agency. So we will probably request those of the technical specifications of proposed procurements. For those technical specifications on information on what that might be, 200.325 will list that out specifically, but just know that you now have to provide information on technical specifications of proposed procurements. I'll go on to the next slide of revision of budget and program plans. So back when I was talking about prior approval, some changes have occurred that now when you revise a budget or a program plan, you'll need to request prior approval before you do so. So that means if there's a change in key personnel or a change to the budget plan or a change to the program itself, before that actually occurs, you need to ask for prior approval to make that change. This does include a pass-through entity. And when you make these changes, if they are approved, you need to use the same formatting. So with the same document type you used to initially submit your budget details, we want you to use that same format when you submit a revised budget. This kind of makes it easier for everyone. Sorry about the pause. And lastly on this, we're now charging pre-award costs to the initial budget period. Just a little side note there. The big thing is you need prior approval to make any changes to the program budget plan, and this does include changing key personnel. I'll continue on to performance management and pass it over to my colleague, Shanika.
Thank you so much, Chris. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up here with 200.301 performance management. And so the biggest takeaway for this part of the guidance is that EPA is required to communicate program goals and objectives that are in the federal award. And this guidance also talks about the outputs and outcomes that will be measured. And so that's the biggest takeaway that I have for you for this particular part regarding performance management. Next slide. 200.329. This is monitoring and reporting program performance. So I have a few key takeaways for you for this slide to kind of sum up this part of the guidance. And so the first piece is that this update clarifies that the monitoring and reporting program performance section also applies to subrecipients. The second piece is that agencies are not required to submit unnecessary information for monitoring the award. And so you're no longer, everything that you're asked to submit will be necessary. You will not be asked to submit unnecessary documents or information. And then the third piece is that this guidance clarifies when a subrecipient must submit reports to pass-through entities. And so again, you'll consult this guidance here just for the specifics, but that's just like the 3 key points to pull from this particular part of the presentation or the slide. Next slide, please. All right, looking into the payment and financial requirement certifications. And so there's a few takeaways here as well. So with 200.305, which is the federal payment portion, advanced payment is already the default payment for recipients and subrecipients other than states. And so recipients and subrecipients must do a few things. So they must be authorized to submit payment requests often. They must maintain advance payment in interest-bearing accounts if accessible, and then they must return all interest that's more than $500 to the PMS, the payment management system. When we look into 200.415, the biggest takeaway for that section is that subrecipients under the federal award must certify to the pass-through entity whenever possible, and this was a new section that was added. And so I just wanted to note that that's also like a new piece that was added to that part of the guidance. Next slide. Looking at 200.328, the financial reporting, I would like to say that OMB clarified deadlines for financial reporting. And so federal agencies and pass-through entities may require more frequent reporting in accordance with specific conditions that's outlined in 200.208. You can also see 200.344 that kind of talks on this as well, but that's the newest thing. You may be asked to report a little more frequently. Next slide. That's like the biggest takeaway there. And then for no cost extensions, cost allowability, and participant support costs, a few things to highlight here. So when we're looking at 200.308, the revision of budget and program plans, recipients do not need prior approval of individual subrecipients under all circumstances. But this is necessary when making subawards not proposed by the recipient in the application. And so revisions were made to 200.308, subset F, and it's requiring prior approval when transferring funds between construction and non-construction work. Another piece to highlight is the participant support costs, which is under 200.456. And with this, participant support costs must be documented in the recipient's or subrecipient's written policies and procedures and treated consistently across all federal awards. So those are the big takeaways for this particular part of the guidance. And I am actually going to turn it back over to my colleague, Chris.
Alrighty now, thank you, Shanika. We're on the home stretch, folks, so I appreciate your patience in this presentation. For now, I'll talk to you a little bit about applicability and auditing requirement changes. First and foremost, in 200.101, there's been an inclusion of non-federal entities subject to audits. If you go into that specific 101 and go to subsection F of that, you'll find a list that are of the non-federal entities that are now subject to audits. I won't read you out that list right now, distract you from the information I'm providing, but you can go find that list of non-federal entities that are now subject to audits in 101 subpart F. Along the audit information thread, a new change to the threshold for audits is that a non-federal entity that expends $1 million or more is now the threshold for an audit. So it went up from $750,000 to $1 million, that audit threshold. And then a last bit of information regarding applicability and auditing requirements, and kind of throughout the entirety of 2 CFR 200, I just figured I'd highlight it now on this slide, is that OMB updated the use of the words and the word or. The use of the word or might now include circumstances where it's the recipient or the subrecipient, or it's the both subrecipient and recipient. So just a heads up that that language might have changed. That language has changed within the document, but just pay attention to that when you're reading, please. Going on to the next slide. Talking about equipment and supplies disposition. So that's in reference to slides 12 and 13 earlier that Shanika was discussing equipment and supplies on. I think the note here, and this is a big update for tribes, because following the procurement methods that you're now able to follow, if you set them up yourselves, if you have your own procurement methods and your own disposition methods, you can follow those. If you don't have procurement methods or disposition methods set up already, you'll be subject to 313 and 314 disposition rules. So just a heads up on that. If you have your own procurement methods and disposition methods set up, you'll use those. If not, you'll be beholden to use 313's E and F equipment disposition rules and 314's supply disposition rules. And then another side note to this, the threshold has gone up to $10,000, so you do have to be aware of that. Go on to closeout. Okay, folks, like I said, we're in the home stretch. It's important to know in the changes to 2 CFR 200 document in regards to closeout and termination, that now within 120 days, that's specifically 120 days of the conclusion of the period of performance for your award, all final reports are due. And in regards to that, you must liquidate all financial obligations incurred under a subaward within 90 days of the conclusion of the period of performance. Closeout costs, specifically administrative costs associated with the closeout, are actually now specifically listed in 200.472 subsection B. It's labeled closeout costs. Just a helpful information there regarding, again, administrative costs you might associate with closeout costs. So 120 days, 90 days, and the closeout costs in subsection B 472 is what you should take away from this slide. Now, folks, that does conclude the major portion of our presentation. So, you know, a little round of applause. We got some quick facts before we end up because we do have some frequently asked questions. Before I get to these, I just like to put in a little joke because I know we've all been sitting here for a while. It's called the Uniform Grants Guidance, or is often abbreviated the UGG. And I wonder if anyone has an idea why they abbreviate it to that. And if you don't know why they call it the UGG, well, it's because it makes you want to go ugh when you read it. So I'll be here all week, folks, but frequently asked question. So how does this impact existing and new grants? Well, the revisions of the Uniform Grant Guidance go into effect on all grants awarded on October 1st, 2024 or later. Those awarded prior to October 1st, 2024 will be governed by the regulations at the time of the award. So again, those awarded after October 1st will be governed by the revised regulations that have gone into effect on October 1st. Now, for those existing awards that went into effect prior to October 1st, 2024, if you receive incremental or supplemental funding, EPA's current policy is that the new regulations will apply once that incremental supplemental funding is processed, and you as a recipient may now point to the new regulations once they receive an increase in funds. So once these incremental or supplemental funding is processed and cleared, you can now utilize the new guidance measures set forth on October 1st and apply those to the new funding you have received. Another quick question we get is about the minimus rates. So if you applied during the summer of 2024, but were awarded on or after October 1st, 2024, the question is, will the applicant be able to revise our indirect cost from 10% to 15% per the new regulations? So again, remember that the minimus rate did increase to 15%. Well, I tell you this, the set of regulations that apply to the project is based on the award date of the grant. So if you applied for an award in the summer of 2024, but weren't actually awarded the grant until October 1st, 2024 or later, you'll be using the new 15% de minimis. So you'll have to apply that de minimis rate and confirm with the other changes we've noted in this presentation to your award. Again, so if you applied in 2024, in the summer of 2024 even, but weren't awarded a grant until October 1st or after October 1st, 2024, you'll be using, I think I misspoke. If you applied during 2024 and are awarded that grant on October 1st or later, you'll be using the new set of guidances and regulations. That includes the new indirect costs. Now, I did misspeak, so you might be a little confused, and we did kind of clear through a lot of information in this presentation. I understand it could kind of just get stuck in your head and your eyes glaze over and you're like, yeah, that's a lot of information. I'm not going to really register all of that. We do have a set of additional resources on the next slide. And I'd like to highlight the first one because it's ours, because we made it. It's EPA's 2 CFR 200 update page. We like to call it the one-stop shop because we think if you go there having any question regarding 2 CFR 200 and the updates that occurred, you'll find it in that page. So we hope you go and check out and utilize the resources there. There's a lot of information, including new policy changes, including new form changes. And we hope you can we believe rather you can answer all your questions by stopping on that page. But another good web page to visit if you have questions on the 2 CFR guidance changes is the Council on Federal Financial Assistance, or COFA. They have a lot of good information there. They reveal a guiding force behind the scenes to the actual changes you've seen in this presentation. So take it as you'll be taking this information from the horse's mouth when you visit the COFA 2 CFR guidance page. But again, because it's our page, and we made it, and this is the EPA presenting to you, I'd like to highlight the EPA's 2 CFR 200 update page as your one-stop shop to find any and all information on the updates to the 2 CFR guidance. So with that, I appreciate your time. I thank you for attending from both myself and for Shanika Snipe. and the whole policy team behind us, we'd like to thank you for attending this webinar. We will be posting it online in about 2 weeks. So thank you for attending.